Hello and welcome back to The Path, the podcast from Lifestyle RX. My name is Dan, and joining me as always is Dr. Brendan Byrne. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dan.
Good. All right. So in this episode, we're going to tackle a topic that I know is sometimes confusing for a lot of people, myself included. I'm looking forward to hearing these answers. But today we're talking about inflammation. So this is something that you hear about a lot, and it kind of not sure. At least I'm not sure of what the exact definition is and how it plays in with diabetes. So maybe we should just start off with, what is inflammation? What does that mean?
Okay. So inflammation is your body's immune response to injury or infection. And so it's basically kind of one of our repair mechanisms. If we injure ourselves, we will trigger some inflammation, or if we have an infection, we'll trigger inflammation. And so when you think of inflammation from an injury standpoint, you usually think of things like, it's painful, it's red, it's swollen, it's tender, and it just hurts to do anything with it. So that's acute inflammation, and that's what happens when you get an acute injury. When you get an acute infection, I think we all unfortunately know about that. We'll often get fever, we'll lose our appetite, our mood goes down. There's a whole bunch of things that happen all at once. And so what's interesting with inflammation is it's very, very necessary to survive. You need to have an ability to mount an inflammatory response, or else you're going to die of an infection, or you're not going to heal an injury. And so when you look at inflammation, it's there are these two different kind of sets of conditions that lead to the inflammatory response, and they're called PAMPs and DAMPs. So PAMP is a pathogen-associated molecular pattern, and a DAMP is a damage-associated molecular pattern. So again, pathogen is infection, damage is injury, and kind of it's interesting. What you're seeing is basically there's something that's triggering the immune system that, hey, not all is well here, right? And so if you twist your ankle, it could be that, just that twisting, you kind of may rupture a little bit of the tendon, and that's, there's some, breakdown, and, that releases a bit of a pattern, and then it cascades upon itself. And so this notion of a cascade is really important, because in that acute inflammation, we want to respond really quickly to this thing, because, if it's an infection per se, we don't really want to let the one bacteria, keep doubling until, it overwhelms our system. And because of that, we need to respond like it's a 7-alarm fire. And so I often think of inflammation and this metaphor of fire trucks. And so acute inflammation, we want a 7-alarm fire. We want 7 fire trucks landing on that, injury site or that infection site. And we just want to blast the heck out of that fire to make sure that it doesn't cause damage to the rest of ourselves, right? And so, and then afterwards, we've got to clean it up, right? And so you have this kind of massive cascade with inflammation. Again, acute inflammation, this massive cascade, 7-alarm fire. And as you can imagine, that whatever was injured isn't going to look in great shape to begin with, right? And so think back to your sprained ankle. It usually didn't hurt that much right away, but boy, about 3 hours later, it just throbs, right? That's again, the 7-alarm fire actually contributes to some of the damage. And then there's a process that kicks in that's basically this resolution process. And so we kind of have this balance between the inflammatory cascade and the resolving cascade. And that's kind of the way that things are supposed to work, right? And we can get as inflamed as we need to, and then we can heal, and then we go back to kind of this balanced state. It doesn't always work out that way. And so sometimes what happens is we don't we either get so much damage that we get the best we can do is we can heal with some scarring or fibrosis. And so, I think we've all probably had, kind of injuries that don't fully heal, right? And you end up with kind of a loss of function from that damage. But sometimes you can get these other patterns where you get chronic inflammation. And so this isn't like a 7-alarm fire where the 7 fire trucks land on that house and spray it down with water. This is like one fire truck driving around the neighborhood, just randomly spraying stuff, right? Like it's not great, right? And it's actually not going to be super helpful. And so this chronic inflammation is actually the problem that we see, that's related to type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. And so it's something that we can start to kind of unpack here as we go through the podcast.
Cool. And then, so what's the relationship between inflammation and insulin resistance?
Yeah. So this is, it's like a lot of things in our health in our body. There's this bidirectional relationship. So if a cell is inflamed, so if a liver cell is inflamed, and it's being affected by inflammation, the insulin receptor doesn't work properly. So inflammation itself can cause insulin resistance. Turns out insulin resistance also causes some degree of inflammation, both directly because as insulin levels go up in response to the insulin resistance, we'll see an inflammatory response there, but also because of the process that leads to insulin resistance, which is really the energy overload, kind of the fat in the wrong places, the fat in the cells of the liver, the fat in the cells of the muscle, and then the fat tissue itself becoming kind of swollen and enlarged. All of those things ends up causing some degree of inflammation within those cells. And so you get this bidirectional relationship where, if you have inflammation, it's going to make your insulin resistance worse. But the nature of the insulin resistance developing will probably have led you to have some inflammation.
Well, and then when you have this chronic inflammation, how does that contribute then to type 2 diabetes?
So again, kind of the when you think about kind of the key cells for the development of insulin resistance, right? So back up, type 2 diabetes is this balance between how much insulin your pancreas can produce and how much resistance there is to that insulin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so on the insulin resistance side of the equation, what you really have there is that the key cells that are being affected by inflammation, the key cells in insulin resistance are all also affected by inflammation. So again, kind of muscle, liver, and the adipose or fat tissue. On the pancreas side, inflammation actually decreases the pancreas's ability to release insulin, and it affects the beta cells negatively. So you actually lose some degree of beta cell function just due to inflammation.
And then, what are some of the markers or something you could check for this inflammation, and how are those associated with insulin resistance?
So there's a term called acute phase reactance, which when I was explaining that 7-alarm fire and that cascade, there's all sorts of proteins that are released in response to that. In fact, there's about 40 different acute phase proteins that you can measure. And most of them go up. Some actually go down, but most of them go up. The two that we measure in the program are HSCRP. So a lot of people will see that on their blood work. HSCRP, what is that? High sensitivity C-reactive protein. And that kind of has become what we call kind of the gold, standard for, diagnosing this chronic inflammation. And but it's not the only one, and it's not up all the time. And so the other one that we measure is ferritin. And so ferritin is a protein that carries iron in your body, and we use ferritin to see what your iron storage capacity is. So a lot of times people are thinking of ferritin in the context of, well, am I iron deficient? And a low ferritin would designate that you probably are. But a high ferritin is essentially a response to inflammation. So again, one of the things the liver does when there's inflammation is it releases more HSCRP and it releases more ferritin. So when we assess people, we'll see those two markers going up, and those are kind of signs that there's probably inflammation. You'll also kind of know, like in our wellness quotient, we ask a whole bunch of questions that we put under kind of a inflammation index, and
Mm.
there's a bunch of symptoms that are associated with inflammation, and so we can kind of look at those symptoms. Even if HSCRP and ferritin don't give us a clue, but there's a lot of symptoms there, we might think that there is some underlying inflammation that's significant.
And then, so if we reduce that inflammation, the chronic inflammation, does that help with type 2 diabetes? Or like, is that part of the reversal process that we go through in the program?
Yeah, so anything that you can do to reverse that inflammation, and so maybe there's a key thing when we're talking about this chronic inflammation is thinking about it as being systemic, right? So I've kind of talked about it being kind of localized, but the cascade, that kind of immediate thing that you see with the 7-alarm fire, but
Mhm.
that cascade process means that there are these circulating inflammation kind of signals throughout the body, and it is quite systematic. So if you're getting chronic inflammation really from any source, it's going to make your insulin resistance worse, right? And so this is important to kind of think of, because it actually tells us if we find a source of inflammation, then if we can get that inflammation to settle, that'll actually it'll help improve things from an
Mhm.
insulin resistance standpoint. And so much of the work that we do on insulin resistance is breaking this vicious cycle of insulin resistance, where you get insulin resistance, the pancreas responds by producing more insulin, and that in turn leads to the conditions that lead to more insulin resistance, right? And
Mhm.
so that vicious cycle, anything we can do to kind of decrease one part of it, where okay, well now for a completely different reason we're seeing inflammation drop a little bit, which allows the insulin resistance to improve, it's going to help here.
Yeah. Okay. And then, I mean, we go through a bunch of different things in the program, but one of them obviously is changing diet. Is there impacts on inflammation from dietary based things or diet changes?
Yeah, so diet has an incredibly large role to play here, and so the first is actually just reversing a negative. There are diets that are very inflammatory, and so by now that I I harp on a lot about ultra processed foods. Um, Ultra processed foods, I mean, first of all, they have stuff in them that is actually inflammatory to our gut, plain and simple. But a high sugar, high fat diet, if we feed them to lab animals, they get inflammation, right? So if you take
Yeah.
the equivalent of ultra processed food and feed it to a rat and measure HSCRP in the rat, it goes up with ultra processed food. So there definitely is that, and that's why with the shift to whole foods is so important. We're always kind of pushing people to get rid of those ultra processed foods. So clearly, kind of improving the diet is going to help there. Beyond that, when we look at whole foods have a whole bunch of different things in them, and
Mhm.
we're just like the people call it the food matrix, but it's the complexity of food is kind of in the original, kind of if it's in the cell that it came from, is quite stunning, and there's all sorts of things that um, will trigger like little bits of inflammation. Like, so if you think about like plants, right? So plants produce a lot of things to try not to get eaten, because it's generally not good for
Yeah.
the life. Plant's not going to be able to reproduce if it's all gets eaten before it
Yeah.
can be. And young plants especially, right, before they kind of live through. So there'll be things that are kind of bitter for animals, so animals won't eat it. But those compounds, interestingly, when we consume them in small quantities, actually we get a little bit of a response to it that
Hmm.
allows us. It actually tempers our own inflammation system. So the
Interesting.
complexity of our food is actually quite interesting, just in terms of some of these things that flavonoids and polyphenols that are in various different foods that we eat. And it's one of the reasons why we encourage people to kind of eat the rainbow, is you get a ton of these compounds. And no, you don't go find the supplement with the same thing in it. You just eat lots of eat the rainbow of vegetables, and you'll get a lot of this stuff. The other one that I like to draw a lot of attention to is fiber. And fiber, we don't absorb fiber. So fiber falls into kind of the carbohydrate macronutrient, and carbs are made up of sugars and starches. Those things break down to glucose in our blood, but fiber doesn't break down. And fiber is kind of the food for our gut bacteria. And so our gut bacteria, when they eat fiber, they will convert it into something called short chain fatty acids. And short chain fatty acids will circulate throughout the body, and they have amazing effects in terms of satiation. In fact, they increase GLP-1, so it's kind of like your own natural Ozempic. But yeah, if you feed your bacteria, they'll produce some GLP-1 for you. But the short chain fatty acids also play a big role in terms of dampening inflammation. And then and they also if you have a lot of the healthy bacteria, well, it's interesting, right? So if you don't get enough fiber, the bacteria in your gut will start to eat the mucin, which is the lining that protects the gut, the epithelial cells in your gut. And so if you don't get enough fiber, you won't have very much mucin because your bacteria will have eaten it. And then your gut will actually leak, and you'll get inflammation directly from your gut.
And so interesting.
And remember, the blood from the gut drains directly into the liver. So that is absolutely going to give you insulin resistance. One of the things that we highlight kind of in our assessment is we call it the gut health index, and it's really just digestive symptoms. So things like constipation or indigestion or bloating or abdominal pain or diarrhea or oily stools, kind of where clearly your digestive system's not working kind of perfectly well. If you look at your gut health index on your wellness quotient and it's less than 7, there probably is some gut inflammation that's going on. And addressing your diet through the kind of steps that we'll do in the program for insulin resistance will actually usually resolve that. If it doesn't resolve that, then we often kind of will suggest that people work one-on-one with a dietitian. And there it gets a little bit more complicated because maybe there's some foods in your diet that are actually causing a bit of inflammation. So first thing you start, get rid of the ultra processed foods, get the whole foods, start to build up the fiber, maybe have the fermented foods to kind of help kind of encourage your healthy bacteria. But you're doing all that and you're kind of at week 7 of the program and it's not really helping very much with your digestive symptoms. Then we start to look at, well, are there particular foods that are causing some inflammation? And the two that really come to mind, all the time are wheat and dairy. Wheat because of the gluten. And so a small percentage of the population is celiacs. They actually amount to, the gluten causes an autoimmune, response that actually damages the intestine. But that's only about 3% of the population. But there are about 15% of the population that just don't really tolerate gluten well. And they get some, it's probably not a true autoimmune response and you can't measure it with, blood tests for antibodies, but they clearly get digestive symptoms with wheat. And so for those people kind of, getting off of any wheat and going kind of more gluten-free can be helpful. And then the other one we kind of have to sometimes look at is dairy, because some of the proteins in cow's milk and dairy products can be more inflammatory. And so sometimes switching, if you go from kind of cow's milk to goat milk or goat cheese or something like that, that may help as well. And then there's a kind of a whole other kind of process around FODMAPs, and I won't go into that because really, if you're doing the reading online and you think that FODMAPs are kind of your thing, that may be what's causing it, don't do that on your own. Do that with a professional. Do that with a dietitian. Work through a process. You'll get a good result that way with kind of not having to change everything. So anyway, huge rambling answer for, diet plays a huge role, Dan, in insulin resistance and inflammation.
Awesome. And then I guess the other components of the program we go through, what about exercise? How does that impact inflammation?
Yeah, so exercise, I say to people all the time, I think it's our best natural anti-inflammatory of something that we can do that will decrease inflammation. And the reason for that is really that exercise actually provokes some degree of inflammation. And so when you exercise, so if we took somebody, halfway through their run or when they're doing a high intensity interval, and we took blood from them, their inflammation scores would be off the chart. In fact, I was a medical director for a company that was doing kind of complex, basically proteomics. So they'd measure, hundreds of different proteins in the blood, and they were doing something with the UBC rowing team, and nobody got the memo about not doing the workout before the blood draw. And so the UBC, they all had an early AM blood draw, but they had all rowed that morning, right?
Yeah.
And so we got the blood results back, and they're just off the charts for inflammation. These guys looked like the least healthy people on the planet, except for when you met them, and they're all like, the picture of health.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it turns out if you measure somebody very shortly, either when they're exercising or shortly thereafter, there's this inflammatory response, this cascade that you see kind of in that acute inflammation. But that triggers the body's natural balance, which is this resolution phase. And so you trigger a little inflammation, and then this whole cascade of resolution kicks in. And I always think about it like the Zamboni going on the ice, right? And it's so you think about, I always think about like free skates and just how, chewed up the ice becomes, and, from all the different things that caused it. And then the Zamboni comes out, and the ice is all, that's what happens after your exercise, is you get this recovery phase, and it dampens inflammation everywhere.
Interesting.
The other thing about exercise that's interesting, and I think we touched on this in another episode of the podcast, Herman Ponsner, who wrote that book, Burn, about the energy constraint model, where basically, you can't really out exercise at energy overload, right? Like your body will only burn so many calories. And, so the more you exercise, it actually decreases other systems in your body.
Yeah.
One of the systems that decreases is the inflammatory system. So just the exercise, it's, so if you think about it, right, if there's this energy constrained model, and it's kind of the way I think about it is we're going to burn somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 calories a day, no matter what, right? And that's kind of the average. That's probably more the average guy, but somewhere in, let's say, in that range. If we exercise and we're, our active exercise and activity, kind of is actually using, 500 to 1,000 of that. It's not that we're going to, suddenly, have an extra 500 or 1,000 calories, burnt that we can go eat. What it is it's going to decrease 500 to 1,000 calories of, energy that's going to inflammation, energy that's going to stress response, right? So, why is exercise such a great stress reliever? You just don't have the energy to be stressed, right? Like literally, your body doesn't have the energy. So the exercise also plays that role. So, one is it triggers inflammation and it triggers that resolution. But the second is it just naturally, if you're constantly using your energy for activity, there's just less energy available for this chronic inflammation, and the body tones it down a little bit. So it can be very powerful as well.
Interesting. And then I guess continuing our quick tour of the program here, what about stress and sleep, the +2? How do they affect it?
Yeah. So stress and can trigger an inflammation response in and of itself, and chronic stress leads to kind of all the conditions that lead towards insulin resistance and can build that way as well. So, and then you think about what happens with stress and food choices and things like that. So there's all sorts of byproducts that kind of cascade off of stress, but the actual stress response itself does have an inflammatory component to it. Poor sleep. Sleep is one of our ultimate resolution. For it's a resolution for stress, but it's also a resolution for inflammation. We tend to tone things down at night, right? And it's an opportunity to kind of fully repair things. So both can have an effect there. And sleep also, just from a brain perspective, one of the things that's fascinating, and I didn't know this, until a few years ago. And in fact, kind of when I was in medical school, we didn't even know this existed, but there's these channels in our brain that they call lymphatics, right? So kind of like your lymph system in the rest of your body, there's this basically drainage that happens at nighttime when you're sleeping of metabolites from the daytime's thinking and processing. So don't sleep and that stuff just kind of doesn't really get cleared, that actually triggers brain inflammation.
Hmm.
And that plays a role in Alzheimer's and dementia. It also plays a role in terms of mood, because of inflammation and depression go hand in hand. It also plays a role in terms of insulin resistance, from the standpoint of, there's a lot of people that think that you get a certain degree. So insulin should be a satiating hormone, right? Insulin should actually, when insulin levels go up, it's a signal that you've just eaten, right? It's we've
Yeah.
got time to store energy. One of the things that should happen, just like we see with the GLP-1s, is that signal should actually go to the brain and tell your kind of appetite and satiation center that don't really need to eat. There's some insulin resistance happening in the brain that signal doesn't really work very well, and so that is a kind of another place where the inflammation can play a role. So again, sleep is it's our great reset, and I in the week on sleep, I make this point, but again, I think it's worth emphasizing so much, which is you have to go back to jellyfishes and sponges to find organisms that don't sleep.
No sleep.
We spend like a third of our lives asleep.
Yeah.
It's got to be important. like seriously, because you think about it, if it was kind of optional, then some other species that didn't sleep would kind of have devoured us, right? So like we're vulnerable when it's got to be hugely important, and the more that we learn about sleep, the more that we know its importance. So sleep definitely helps kind of reset some of the inflammatory response.
Cool. And then, so up until this point, we've been talking more sort of the lifestyle factors, but are there any medications or like supplements that you can take that would also decrease the chronic inflammation?
Yeah. So I like the way that we ordered it. So that's great, because we definitely, lifestyle medicine, we place lifestyle first and then medicine later. And I kind of throw supplements into the medicine realm. That being said, there are two supplements that kind of border on food, right? So vitamin D, we can get a little bit of vitamin D from food, but by and large, we make vitamin D from sunlight, and but we're not making a lot of vitamin D today, because
it has been cloudy here, I think, for the past 2 weeks. I've not seen the sun.
And in the northern hemisphere, between October and April, the sun's too low in the sky, that the UV rays that would trigger vitamin D production get absorbed by the atmosphere, just because of the angle that the sun comes in on. So you should be supplementing with vitamin D throughout the winter. That can have a role in inflammation, and if you don't have that vitamin D, it can have a role. The other is omega-3s, right? So omega-3s are one of the essential fatty acids. So it's fat that we need to eat. We can't make omega-3s. So omega-3s and omega-6s are both essential. The 6s we get a ton of, like, in our diet, and especially the more kind of processed your diet is, the more 6s you're going to get. The 3s are a little bit harder to come by, and most people are out of balance with the 3s and 6s. And the food that we have today does not, like, so even kind of, if you took meat from, that somebody would have found like 100 years ago, kind of off of a farm, and took the fat in that meat, it would have more omega-3s than it does today, just because of the way the animals are fed and taken care of. So often, we kind of look at it and say, fish is a great source of omega-3s. The fat in fish has omega-3s. But if you don't eat fish twice a week, you probably benefit from some supplements. And there's lots of plants that have omega-3s, but they don't have the long chain omega-3s. And so, kind of to be sure, you should take a supplement that has the long chain omega-3s, the DHA and the EPA. And so that's something that you definitely can do as well. Curcumin or turmeric, kind of the spice, actually has a role, in dealing with inflammation. Again, kind of one of these plant compounds that seems to trigger kind of an anti-inflammatory response. You can get a supplement that's a little bit better absorbed into the bloodstream. The one that I use is called Theracumin, and that can help with inflammation. Magnesium. So sometimes we'll recommend people supplement with magnesium if they're having kind of cramps at night, or sometimes it'll help with sleeping. It also does help a little bit with inflammation as well. So those are some that we kind of will direct people towards. some of the medications that we use actually have anti-inflammatory responses, and metformin actually has a bit of an anti-inflammatory response, believe it or not.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and part of its effect is actually happening in the gut, right? So some of the side effects of metformin is you can get some digestive symptoms, um, but metformin actually leads to somewhat of an improvement in terms of the gut microbiome. And so metformin is
Hmm.
actually useful that way, as from an anti-inflammatory perspective. Yeah, berberine, it's kind of like we always kind of say it's kind of like the supplement version of metformin, even though it does a lot of the same things, even though very different mechanisms of action. It too has that kind of
Hmm.
gut-based microbiome benefit. So those things can help. Then if we look at other drugs that you might be taking for other reasons, so a lot of people with type 2 diabetes will take statins to manage and decrease their LDL cholesterol. And I think the internet loves to beat up on statins for all sorts of reasons. But one of the things that's very apparent is that they actually decrease systemic inflammation.
Hmm.
And there are some people that think that the decrease in heart disease, like, so statins have been categorically shown to to decrease cardiovascular death.
Yeah.
If you, especially if somebody who's got known cardiovascular disease, there really is a benefit. For patients with diabetes, there very much is a benefit to lower your LDL. Some people think that the benefit of the statin is from the anti-inflammatory response to the statin,
Interesting.
and not purely from the reduction in the LDL cholesterol.
Hmm.
I don't know enough about that to really lean in
Yeah.
either way. But it is kind of, if you are taking a statin, you can kind of feel good if you're getting this little bit of an anti-inflammatory basis.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we had to go over. That was a great overview. Anything you want to wrap up with? Anything to tie it up the whole conversation?
No, I think it's just one of those things that it's I joke in a presentation I give on inflammation. I call it a suitcase word. It seems like one of those words where there's so much to unpack from this one word.
Hmm.
Um, it's just really, really important from a root cause perspective for many diseases that cause lots of health issues in our society.
Hmm.
Um, I think the bottom line of it is, and it's a little bit like the insulin resistance and kind of what we're doing with the program, the best anti-inflammation is not going to come from a pill that you take or a medication that you take. It's going to come from, if you can align your lifestyle correctly, it'll do
Yeah.
a lot to kind of resolve the inflammation. And then in certain circumstances, and there's certain conditions where you might need to do something more. But if you do all these things, you probably won't, and you'll probably not really have much of an issue with inflammation.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you so much for once again sharing your knowledge with us. And of course, if you have any questions that you'd like us to go over on the podcast, we're always looking for new topics and questions to answer. So leave a comment on the community post or on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you're listening. There should be a spot where you can leave comments. And we do look at all those, and we will try and get to the topics in future episodes. So um, if you're interested in joining the Lifestyle RX program or know anyone that is, you can go to lifestylерx.ca to sign up. And it's covered by provincial health in Alberta, BC, and Ontario. So thank you so much again for your time today, Brendan, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, man.